The conservative movement has been fortunate, I might even say blessed, to be led by a remarkable group, actually remarkable groups, 4 of them: philosophers, popularizers, politicians, and philanthropists. First came the men of ideas. We've already been talking about them this evening. Intellectuals, philosophers like Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian-born classical liberal, Russell Kirk, the Midwestern traditionalist, right from your own state, right here in Michigan. And boy, that was such a shock to people, that the conservative mind, this work of genius, would be written by a unknown young assistant professor at a cow college, which is what Michigan State was 50 years ago. It was a cow college, not even a university. It was that, Michigan State College. Next came the men of interpretation. So first you had these philosophers laying out these ideas. Then came the men of interpretation. The journalists and popularizers like Bill Buckley, George Will, the television commentator, and of course the fabulous, unrestrained, forever flowing Rush Limbaugh. They translated conservative ideas into the common idiom. Last came the men of action. First the philosophers, then the popularizers, then the men of action, the politicians and policymakers who said, oh, I can take these ideas and do something with them. I can translate them into policies, programs, platforms to run on. And I think in particular that we've had these, what I call the 4 misters over these last several decades, the 4 misters. Mr. Republican, Senator Robert A. Taft of Ohio, Mr. Conservative, Barry Goldwater of Arizona, Mr. President, Ronald Reagan, and Mr. Speaker, Newt Gingrich. But the philosophers would not have been able to write their books, and the popularizers would not have been able to publish their magazines, and the politicians would not have been able to run their campaigns without the support of conservative philanthropists, men of vision and means, such as J. Howard Pugh, the head of Sun Oil Company, who gave ISI its first $1,000. Joe Coors, the beer baron from Colorado, who invested $250,000 in Heritage back in 1973. Without that investment, Heritage would not exist today. And Henry Salvatore, a California oilman, who put up most of the money for Ronald Reagan's 1964 speech for Barry Goldwater, without which Ronald Reagan would never become the governor of California and president of the United States of America. Now, this conservative ascendancy was also helped by the decline and fall of American liberalism. Its swift descent marked by what? A concern, shifting of concern for the common man and middle America, which is what Democrats like Harry Truman and others way back the dim mists of time were interested in, to a preoccupation with minorities and special interests. Conservatives also triumphed in the 1980s and the 1990s with this foundation I've talked about, when their movement contained what I call the 5 essential elements for political success. A clear, consistent philosophy, a broad-based national constituency. We're talking about a national movement, must be a national constituency. But if you want to have a state movement, it has to have a statewide constituency. A sound financial base, proficiency in the mass media, and most important, charismatic, principled leadership. And I'll return to those and talk a little bit more about them. Conservatives were also helped because there was an atmosphere of crisis, too. Think about it. In 1980, Americans were sharply aware that the nation required leaders who would cope with critical problems like unemployment, high interest rates, and the Soviet Empire. Their answer was to turn to Ronald Reagan. In 1994, the people demanded that something be done about out-of-control government programs like welfare. Newt Gingrich, the rest of his band, came up with a contract with America. But, and this is important, life in this target-rich environment had unintended consequences. Go back to what Henry was talking about. We always have to look for unintended consequences. Some Americans began to believe that government was always the problem. Always the problem. A position, by the way, that Ronald Reagan never held. What Ronald Reagan said in his first, what Ronald Reagan said in his first inaugural address was, in this crisis, government is not the solution. Government is the problem. That was true. But sometimes you do need government. You know, conservatives are not laissez-faire-ists. We're not anarchists. We do see a role for government. Hayek wrote that. So did Adam Smith. Now, it's true that we miss Ronald Reagan, isn't it? Extraordinary man. I was privileged to interview him over the years, to write a book about it. As a matter of fact, I wrote the first political biography about Ronald Reagan back in 1967. And I have to, maybe I'll just throw in a story here, give some indication to what the kind of man he was, with that wonderful sense of humor. In 1981, I revised and updated my biography, and I wanted to present a copy of this new book, this new biography, to him. So I called up Michael Deaver, whom I knew, and he said, "Oh, sure, we'll set that up." So I was there in the Oval Office in December 1981. Now, remember what happened in March of that year, that near tragedy, the attempted assassination of Mr. Reagan, the president, came out of it, thank God. My publisher said, well, and I'd written a chapter about the whole attempted assassination, all about Hinckley and the whole day, consequences of that. The publisher said, well, look, what we've got to do is to really sell this part of the book. So on the cover was this phrase, complete through the assassination attempt. And great big black letters on a yellow background, it just jumped out at you. Complete through the assassination attempt. So I cringed a little bit at that. But he said, no, we need to do that. So that's the book which I brought to the Oval Office, which I was going to present to the president. So we came in there, and this wonderful smile, he always made you feel so good. He reached out as though, seeing an old friend, shook my hand so warmly, we were talking. It was a photo opportunity, and I said, well, Mr. President, here is this new edition of my book. I want to give it to you. Oh, it's wonderful. While I was talking, and I could see him looking down at the title, Complete Through the Assassination Attempt. I knew he was going to say something, but I didn't know what. And then after about, maybe just 15, 20 seconds, he looked at me, said, wonderful smile. He says, well, Lee, I'm sorry I messed up your ending. Wonderful guy. Wonderful guy. So we miss Ronald Reagan. We miss his soothing presence. And we miss also the unifying thread of communism, which did help to bring together the various strains of conservatism back in those days. As soon as the Berlin Wall came down, conservatives began building walls between one another.